the chords don't go down, but up. Even if it's only a few years between Haydn's Sonata and Pathétique by Beethoven, seems almost a century. But it's true that the chord has to rise like the pump of a water fountain, letting the water go in the air. So I suggest on the modern piano the arpeggiation in the left hand and the plucking in the right hand, which gives amplitude rather than power. And here I have immediately something also in mind, which is the gestures of the hands between beats are in sort of choreographic metronome because of lack of counting independently of playing, since we play by ourselves as pianists rather than orchestra musicians who have to count to be together with the conductor who is the counter-in-chief. And if I count 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, inevitably I don't need the gestures to space justified beats, but rather play the exact proportion of gesture that allows to carve the articulation. The chord, the staccato, the tenuto, independently of the count, which we should do inside ourselves in performance and practice loud voice in playing during studio time. But of course that is also part of the gesture in a way, except that it's unnecessary and unsecure. Another thing which makes Haydn's style different from Mozart and Beethoven for pianists on the modern pianos, lost in translation instrument, is the style, specifically in that sense that the music of Haydn is like trimmed sections with pregnant rests. For instance, the tension of the dotted rhythm, for here rather, and here the rest is the and. So the tension in the wrist, not in the wrist, that's Freudian slip. In the rest is to be pregnant in the sense that is intense, and the release is the short notes, as we hear. We have the short notes from the chord. Another element to put in the mix of thoughts, food for thoughts, hungry lunch or dinner, so many thoughts, is the fact that the theme is downbeatish. So it's not any other silly introduction that obviously he didn't need. Second theme, reminiscent of the first, minus the rhythm in a chorale setting, but also downbeatish, even if it comes from a bridge of a scale. But needs to breathe in the articulation, not staccato like pianists often misunderstand their separation, rather a re-articulation to avoid the slur into it, which gives a wrong reading to the listener that the theme starts on the second note after the beat, rather than, but in the opening no beat to have because, or even if there were one intellectually, perhaps imaginary, there's silence before the first chord. That's why when he comes back to it, he goes, he still gives an eighth note rest, so it restarts on the downbeat. Another thing to play in a Haydn sonata is not a succession of sections, and this and that, and it's written and it's correct and it's right, and I'm trying to count and play cleanly and organized and not too loud and not too soft because I don't know, but I hope to be right, not to shock anybody. No, it is a question about having a construction of sections that have a meaning towards each other. Practice first the thematic materials. Play first only the theme. Then second time. Then a dominant. And in between, bridge number 1, 3 bars. Inverted chromatic scale in the left hand dropping in the bridge of the second time after the dominant, which is 6 bars longer. And then once you have these patches of sections that you realize which is thematic, which is bridging, which is going to the dominant, which is going back to the tonic, then you don't just play bar after bar, section after section, group of sections and group of bars, but you literally construct, organize like a good gardener trimming the garden so that it looks agreeable to the eyes with the perspectives. Of course, it's not natural, but art is artifice, and therefore you cannot say, oh, I'm going to play just as I feel because I'm musical and I feel the tension and the release, because sometimes in the composition, either the publisher, either the manuscript, and it's the bread and butter of musicologists to compare all of these sources, but when you perform it, you shut up, unlike me today, and you don't speak to the audience, you have to speak through your playing. And so your understanding is the sort of GPS reading of the piece that you translate in your playing. And therefore, it is easy to say and difficult to do when you sit next to a student to ask to organize all these sections in a way that they appear like a natural narration. And when the theme returns, you feel like the bridge with the crescendo is natural. Then you observe that the score or the edition says that no, you're supposed to be delaying and then subito forte. And then you do it because it's correct or because you're told, but you really don't integrate it. So the problem is how to play intuitive and musical in your answer to the musical tonal system that is based on tension and release, and how to contradict it intuitively by the score and still appear to believe it when you say it, and not just say, I'm saying it, but really doesn't mean to me, because for me, if you ask me, and I didn't see any addition, I would just go, I exaggerate my crescendo, or I just do, and I don't put pedal on my scale. But after all this, to the problem of the intuition versus the learned, the artifice versus the nature. And then since the artwork is supposed to be man-shaping the nature, and Haydn in the sonata form establishment, at least that's what we think we owe him, is part of that, trimming nature into our desire of organized forms and spaces and different proportions, regardless of what we feel on a modern piano and what he heard on his fortepiano, the Broadwood piano in London when he composed it 3 years after Mozart's death and 5 years before, or 4 so, before Beethoven was the Pathétique. It's unbelievably close in time and space in Europe, but so far away from the harpsichord thinking and the fortepiano thinking, rather than the harpsichord into the fortepiano thinking, like J.C. Bach and transitional composers, if I may say so, instrumentally. Of course, today, if you play it on a modern piano, as we like to call it, we have to be also aware of the balance of the straight-strung pianos of the time when he writes octaves, which on the modern piano overwhelm the 30 seconds. And so if you teach it and you decide to take off the octaves just because on the modern piano the harmonics of the basses are rich enough with the cross-strung pianos where the strings resonate by sympathy, you can say to the student, not to play but one note, but that is then cheating the score, and Henley, and Urtext, and Haydn, and the juries of the world, and the pianists of the world, and how do you dare, etc. So if you don't dare take off the note, then you have to play the octaves, but in order to balance them, then you have to play them softer. And that becomes a problem, because then nothing is natural, nor the dynamics, nor the super surprises, like the Sturm und Drangs in minor, after you have written out 30 seconds, which are in fact grace notes. It's so easy to overdo the Sturm und Drang compared to the original instrument on which he composed it, which would have been a mezzo Sturm und Drang or mezzo forte piano. But then you have to bring closer the dynamic contrasts on the modern piano in order to preserve a sense of style and not indulge or overindulge in what will become in the Romantic era more of the real forte piano, fortissimo, pianissimo. And when you observe the score, so many thoughts come to mind. How do I translate this? How do I present this? How do I balance this? How do I articulate this? How do I bring myself from this point to the next? Well, you have the heard, the read, the taught, the understood, perhaps sometimes the misunderstood, obviously, and ultimately the played. And the played will evolve with the years and the times, because teaching teaches you, performing teaches you. Basically trying to bring alive this structure of beautiful elements, regardless of your degree of knowledge or just intuition, or what balance of the two is the question. And I think that as a teacher, it's a big responsibility to put words on things that we can't really call, because then a hint is an exaggeration, and by the time you mention it, you overdo it. When you talk it to yourself in the privacy of your practicing, you don't have to explain it to yourself, you just try to find it. And then you think you reached it when you think you reached your truth into it. And I think this is marvelous. For the teacher, it's harder to be sort of the spokesman for the composer on behalf of, even more especially when they're dead, and the student who is technically asking how, even if the student knows in their heart how they wish to. And sometimes it matches the intuition, and sometimes it contradicts the intuition. Truly so when you play compared to, you don't want to hit it so hard because you don't want to create that much of a contrast, while you still want to do it fullness and emptiness in a way, rather than loudness and softness. And it is easy to say, difficult to do, because you have to voice and then understand how to follow the real notes. And play all the notes, but then highlight the ones that are the real ones. See this accent on the D flat, and what do I do with it? But there is, because in forgotten detailed writing of the 30 seconds, which could have been, then the chromatic drop is understood, but all of a sudden in the editions we have, it doesn't continue, it stops. Just an empty quarter note, and we're so afraid to add the 30 seconds because Henley is gospel, and who dares question it? But you can argue on that, and you can say Haydn didn't write it as a finished work. It was work in progress. The notation was scarce, and most of the performers were expected to improvise or fill in more than improvise, in a sense, recompose. That's why we have this even whole notes in the modulations. Obviously, it would be unthinkable to play after this. Sorry for this. 30 seconds, that's better, which comes from the Opus 22 Beethoven, or rather Beethoven comes from Haydn. Well, teaches me well to try to give the example of a plagiator for Beethoven, so I couldn't play it right. Some vibes. Anyway, be it as it is, I would say that when you reach this point, which comes from, and then you have these empty chords, they are suggested. So you could go and then improvise just a few lines or perhaps a scale and go. But no, if we do that today, we are burned on a stick like Joan of Arc. What? Who authorized you? How come? No, no way. We play just the ruins. We just stay there. Trying to appear deeply inspired, but in fact, sort of like not knowing why it's there. Because it's in the middle of so many decorations that were written out before. For instance, in this page. And if I take it off and I had written only the whole notes, it'll be like just like into the development. So I think this is written out and this is suggested. But of course, if you do that and it's not published today, you put yourself in trouble. And that's only until you become scholar, and when you become scholar, people might admire you. But if you do it as a student or a teacher has responsibility for the student towards any jury, then you have to tell them, inform them, and tell them, but you really can't do it. And if you could do it, then you have to learn how to do it, because improvised feelings, not complete pieces, are something that has to be also taught. But at the same time, we teach the precision of just playing exactly what's written. So it's almost contradictory, and you have to find the right proportion to explain and suggest and demonstrate what it could have been. And it is true that as a teacher, we're sort of locked between the fact that the score is sort of the alpha and omega of the musical thought of the composer, and that we just need to play it at the best of what we can read from it and not try to flourish it. All I know is that in some sections, like at the end of the Beethoven Sonata, Les Adieux first movement, he has a whole note in octave with crescendo. 2, 3, 4, and then forte. So who's to say that he couldn't have continued? Of course, he didn't have those notes in the high register. Other than, which would sound ridiculous. So every pianist holds it. 2, 3, 4, and here's a crescendo imaginary inside self, and crescendo. But perhaps Beethoven's, like in Haydn, imagine that somebody will improvise a crescendo with a pattern. Again, as soon as we play something different to fill it up with this or that pattern, more or less taken from a plausible pattern that he would have used, then it's wrong and goofy, basically. So it's difficult to allow that as a teacher to the student, because it's responsibility of ethics. You don't teach them to do anything they want. You teach them what they're supposed to do according to what you think it is that the notation is sort of artificially frozen in time from what might have been the tradition of the time, which was more improvisatory. And then some things are very detailed written, and some things are just led to inspiration. And there is the dilemma of the ethics for the teacher. Restitute the integrity of the piece, in your opinion, while you want to inspire the student by the suggested meanings that the composer injected in it through the notes or through the rests or through the whole notes for the modulational cadences. And mostly try to find a sound that defines the soundscape of Haydn on a modern piano. Balances of hands, arpeggiation but not too much, depth at the same time as elevation, thematic material always voiced, and then bridges played in a more neutral sound. To the theme, in different registration, obviously range as well, of course here. Well, it sounds like strings and winds, or at least in our imagination, and then at the same time return to the with or without unicorda, bridge section sound, thematic section sound, and then the lure of the second theme, which is so much more perhaps than to theme sonata development and recap and coda, first Viennese school attributed to Haydn, paternity of that form. I would attribute to Haydn specifically more the sort of lure to the second theme. Before you have a second theme, he gives you a hint that it could have been before. His decoy second theme, even Beethoven hints, but it's not the second theme yet. At least we want not to think it. It's just more like, yeah, it could have been, because it's the first contrasting theme. And then you have the real second theme that comes later. Schumann in the Fantasy does the same thing when you... Oh, I can go far away in all these examples, but I prefer to stay on Haydn and Haydn's way of soundscaping the themes. In the case of the first, some kind of majestic dotted rhythm, more or less distant reminiscence of French overtures. Oops, that would be interesting. In Bach's second partita in minor. Majestic dotted rhythm, delay, relaxation after the tension of the harmonic dominant into the tonic. But three styles, Bach, Haydn, Beethoven, on one piano, and try to define what colorizes them correctly in terms of differentiates them. Because then you have the lighter articulations, so with the 30 seconds that are decorative, the air legato where you play as if you floss your fingers like the teeth to make them clean between the air, between the notes. And then we practice with dotted rhythms as well as with hold and poke to obtain something very clear compared to something perhaps a little bit more connected. Another thing is the left hand, when they have only 8th notes and the right hand has 30 seconds, you have to always delay a little bit the left hand. Again, the choreographic gesture. If you count 1, it allows you to maintain the speed, but at the same time you sort of like lengthen the rest, like the pregnant rest. Enter, so. After all, the design of the 30 seconds, as fast as they are passing tones, neighboring tones, by the semitones, written out mordents. And then you have the leap of the 6th, or the 5th. It shouldn't just be rhythmically play driven. I keep my tempo. No, it's also I keep my tempo in the sense of the direction of the pulse, like Mozart. And here, So I don't suggest to play Hemiola, I was gonna say no for once. No, I don't suggest to play accelerando in a rubato, because that would be unfair to the early Viennese style where things are organized by a group of bars and there are some symmetries and sections. I have to be breathing the well-being of the 4/4, that is the meter. But inside that you can have some different sections where you can inject a little bit of leaning forwardness rather than rushing. Or slightly, in this case, holding back to make the design of the leap of the 5th and the 6th more expressive than just the neighboring tone of the written out mordent. Again, that's over detailing something which is bridge inside the bridge. It's like a miscellaneous, who cares? No. Then establish the tempo at the end, so you don't appear to have moved too far away from the tempo, but you just keep it structurally sound, but you breathe inside it with a little bit of freedom. But this kind of things can't be taught, because if you say it again, a hint is an exaggeration. When you perform it, you realize it. When you present it, it lives with you, and you play it many times. You end up in different situations, pianos and publics, which are obviously every time more or less different, more than less. All of a sudden the piece lives with you for its core facts, and then the rest is how it presents ephemerally and beautifully so on that moment of the day, like a theater play. At 3:02 you say yes, your text. At 3:04 it's gone. It's beautiful, but at the same time it is ephemeral. And so you have to organize this kind of mental architecture that you sort of broadcast to the audience through your understanding of the score. At the same time, as long as you finish the exposition is already gone. But the exposition already exposed themes with connections and bridges, and you felt free enough to breathe a little longer for the rest, perhaps a little faster for the bridge of the 30 seconds. But overall, you keep yourself in the structure of the beats. And that's what I think more important than rigidly sort of searching to be metronomish, and rather be pulsish. to have the pulse bring you from one spot to the next. And of course that sense of natural rubato, as minimal, as nano-rubato as it could be, as it should be, is something that you find when you travel through life with the piece. And when you teach it, you cannot just sort of rhythmicize the rubato, because that would be artificial. And if you allow it, then the student might find themselves a little bit, every day's grooves become deeper, because every day they practice with more rubato. It ends up being an exaggeration, and at the lesson you say, oh my God, you don't keep your tempo. But in fact you should keep your pulse, and the pulse can be a bit differently spaced, as long as the great proportions of the structures of the downbeats are respected, and they are very often clear in Haydn by group of bars, the 4 of the opening, and then, but this time the dominant, and then it all goes from tonic to dominant, dominant to tonic, through other few degrees, because basically the structure of the tonal system allows for tension and releases that are sort of obviously hinted in the work. You don't have this complication of the tonal system as it will happen later in terms of alterations. There are poggiaturas, accacciaturas, and all kinds of alterations, but much lesser, and mostly the effect of major and minor. And so when the second theme blossoms in major in this chorale, in 30 seconds with a hint of minor as a color, that sunshine that comes in when you open the window in the morning. Oh, I welcome nature. If not, you would have been... You already heard it, but just hinting the D flat. So it's not really a lot of chromaticism, but enough to create a sense of well-being when you present the second theme, at least the second theme to me. Thank you.